The morning mist hung low over Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class James McCarthy wiped the sleep from his eyes aboard the USS Arizona. It was December 7, 1941, and the tranquil waters of Oahu reflected the golden Hawaiian sunrise like a mirror of false peace. McCarthy had volunteered for early watch duty, hoping to catch a glimpse of the dolphins that often played in the harbor's warm waters. Instead, what he witnessed would forever scar the American consciousness and transform a reluctant nation into a global superpower. At precisely 7:55 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended from the clouds like mechanical vultures. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the aerial assault, his voice crackling over the radio with the infamous code words, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The surprise was complete. American servicemen, many still in their underwear, scrambled across the decks as the thunder of engines and the whistle of falling bombs shattered the Sunday morning calm. McCarthy watched in horror as torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor's surface, their deadly payloads aimed at Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma took the first devastating hits, listing heavily to port as water rushed into her ruptured hull. Sailors poured from hatches like ants from a disturbed nest, some diving into the oil-slicked waters, others manning whatever guns they could reach. The Arizona, McCarthy's home for the past 2 years, became a primary target. A modified 16-inch, armor-piercing shell, converted into a bomb, penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion that followed was visible from 20 miles away, a towering column of flame and smoke that lifted the massive battleship's bow completely out of the water. In that single terrible moment, over 1,000 men perished, their lives snuffed out in an instant of fire and fury. As documented in Walter Lord's acclaimed historical account, Day of Infamy, the attack lasted just 110 minutes, but its impact would resonate for generations. Across the harbor, the USS California settled slowly into the shallow water, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship. The West Virginia blazed furiously, her superstructure twisted into grotesque shapes by the intense heat. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, despite being wounded by shrapnel, organized firefighting efforts on the Arizona's quarterdeck. His courage under fire would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but in those chaotic moments, he was simply a man trying to save his shipmates from an inferno that seemed to consume everything it touched. The acrid smoke burned their lungs, and the screams of wounded men mixed with the continuing roar of aircraft engines overhead. Young ensigns who had graduated from the Naval Academy just months earlier found themselves thrust into leadership roles they had never imagined. The theoretical became terrifyingly real as they watched their classmates die around them. Some froze in shock, others rose to heroic heights, but all were forever changed by the crucible of that Sunday morning. By 9:45, the last Japanese aircraft disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation. 8 battleships lay damaged or destroyed, 3 cruisers were severely damaged, and over 300 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. Most tragically, 2,403 Americans had lost their lives, with another 1,178 wounded. The date, which will live in infamy, had begun America's transformation from an isolated democracy into the world's dominant military power. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the first reports of the attack while having lunch at the White House with his close advisor Harry Hopkins. The color drained from his face as he listened to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox's shaken voice over the telephone, describing the devastation at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt, who had been quietly maneuvering to bring America into the war against fascism, now faced the grim reality he had both anticipated and dreaded. Across the nation, families gathered around their Philco and RCA radio sets, listening in, stunned silence as news bulletins interrupted regular Sunday programming. The attack on Pearl Harbor was first reported by CBS correspondent John Charles Daly at 2:26 in the afternoon Eastern Time. His voice, steady despite the shocking nature of his report, delivered news that would galvanize 26 million American households. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. In small towns from Maine to California, the news spread like wildfire. At the Paramount Theater in New York City, The matinee showing of Sergeant York was interrupted when the theater manager stepped onto the stage to make the announcement. The audience sat in stunned silence before erupting into angry shouts and patriotic songs. Similar scenes played out in movie theaters, churches, and homes across America as the magnitude of the surprise attack began to sink in. The Japanese strategy, masterminded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had been based on a calculated gamble. Yamamoto believed that a devastating surprise attack would demoralize Americans and convince them to seek a negotiated peace in the Pacific. He could not have been more wrong. Instead of breaking American resolve, the attack on Pearl Harbor united the country as nothing else could have. Regional differences, political party lines, and isolationist sentiment evaporated overnight in the face of national outrage. According to contemporary newspaper accounts from the New York Times, recruitment offices across the country were overwhelmed, with volunteers within hours of the attack. Young men who had spent their Sunday mornings sleeping late or attending church services now stood in long lines, desperate to enlist in the armed forces. The Detroit Free Press reported that by Monday morning, recruitment stations in Michigan had to stay open late into the evening to process all the applications. 20-year-old Robert Bobby Henderson had been planning to start his teaching career after graduating from Teachers College in Pennsylvania. Instead, he found himself standing outside the Navy recruitment office in Pittsburgh at 6 in the morning on December 8th, clutching a newspaper with the headline, "Japs Bomb Pearl Harbor." Bobby represented millions of young Americans whose life plans were instantly transformed by the events at Pearl Harbor. The attack also marked a dramatic shift in American industrial capacity. Factory owners who had been producing consumer goods received urgent calls from government officials asking about their ability to convert to military production. Henry Ford, despite his previous isolationist stance, immediately pledged Ford Motor Company's resources to the war effort. General Motors, Chrysler, and countless smaller manufacturers began the rapid transformation that would make America the arsenal of democracy. Women across the country also felt the call to serve. Many, like 19-year-old Margaret Peggy Sullivan from Iowa, had never worked outside their homes. But as news of the attack spread, Peggy and thousands like her began making plans to join the workforce, taking on roles traditionally held by men who were now heading off to war. The cultural transformation of American society had begun with the first bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond military and industrial considerations. Americans who had felt secure behind two vast oceans suddenly realized their vulnerability. The attack shattered the illusion of American invincibility and geographic immunity that had characterized the nation's approach to foreign conflicts throughout its history. The evening of December 7th found President Roosevelt in his study, hunched over his desk with a yellow legal pad, carefully crafting what would become one of the most important speeches in American history. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier on his shoulders as he struggled to find words that would capture the nation's grief, anger, and determination. Outside the Oval Office, the sounds of urgent activity filled the White House's staff. Members coordinated the government's response to the most devastating attack on American soil since the War of 1812. Secretary of State Cordell Hull arrived at the White House still trembling with rage from his meeting with Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu. The Japanese diplomats had been delivering what they claimed was Japan's final diplomatic proposal at the very moment their countrymen were attacking Pearl Harbor. Hull, normally a gentleman of measured words, had dismissed the envoys with language that would have made a sailor blush, calling their message infamous falsehoods and distortions. Roosevelt's speechwriter, Samuel Rosenman, worked alongside the president through the night. But the speech that emerged was almost entirely Roosevelt's own creation. The president rejected flowery rhetoric and complex explanations in favor of simple, powerful language that every American could understand. He wanted no ambiguity about what had happened or what America's response would be. Each word was weighed carefully, each phrase crafted to convey both the gravity of the situation and the certainty of American resolve. As documented in historian Doris Kearns Goodwin's extensive research on the Roosevelt presidency, the president made numerous handwritten revisions to his speech draft, each one making the language more direct and forceful. Where the original draft read, "A date which will live in world history," Roosevelt's pen changed it to the more powerful, "A date which will live in infamy." This single revision would make the phrase immortal in American memory. Congressional leaders began arriving at the White House before dawn on December 8th. Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn and Senate Majority Leader Alben Barkley met with Roosevelt to coordinate the formal request for a declaration of war. The political divisions that had characterized American debate over foreign policy for the previous 2 years seemed to evaporate overnight. Republicans and Democrats, isolationists and interventionists, all recognized that Pearl Harbor had fundamentally changed America's position in the world. At 12:30 in the afternoon on December 8th, President Roosevelt entered the House of Representatives chamber to address a joint session of Congress. His braces locked in place, he gripped the podium with both hands and began to speak in his distinctive voice, broadcast live to millions of Americans huddled around their radio sets. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech lasted only 6 minutes, but its impact was immediate and profound. Roosevelt methodically detailed Japanese attacks not only on Pearl Harbor, but also on the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, making clear that this was not an isolated incident but part of a coordinated assault on American territory and interests. His voice grew stronger with each accusation, building to the moment when he would ask Congress for what he knew they were ready to give. "I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire." The chamber erupted in applause, with senators and representatives rising to their feet in unanimous support. The vote, when taken, was overwhelming. 470 in favor in the House, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Was, Montana dissenting. The Senate vote was unanimous, 82-0. Within hours of Roosevelt's speech, recruiting stations across the country were overwhelmed with volunteers. The attack that was supposed to discourage American involvement in the war had instead created the largest volunteer military mobilization in the nation's history. Young men like Tommy Morrison from Kansas and Giuseppe DiMaggio from New York's Little Italy found themselves standing in the same recruitment lines, their ethnic and regional differences forgotten in the face of common purpose. The transformation was not limited to military enlistment. American industry, which had been slowly gearing up for possible war production, suddenly shifted into high gear. Factory managers who had been reluctant to retool their production lines now embraced the challenge with patriotic fervor. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not only brought America into World War II, it had awakened a sleeping industrial giant, whose productive capacity would prove decisive in the global conflict ahead. The transformation of American society following Pearl Harbor was swift and unprecedented. Within weeks of the attack, the nation's industrial landscape began a metamorphosis that would ultimately produce more military equipment than all other nations combined. Donald Nelson, appointed by Roosevelt to head the War Production Board, faced the monumental task of converting America's peacetime economy into what would become known as the arsenal of democracy. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan became a symbol of this industrial transformation. Henry Ford, who had previously opposed American involvement in the war, now threw his company's full weight behind the effort to build B-24 Liberator bombers. The massive assembly line, stretching over a mile in length, would eventually produce one bomber every hour, a feat of manufacturing that amazed even seasoned engineers. Workers at Willow Run came from across the Midwest, drawn by good wages and the chance to contribute directly to the war effort. Mary Catherine "Rosie" Henderson, a 23-year-old former department store clerk from Detroit, found herself working as a riveter on bomber fuselages at Willow Run. Like millions of American women, Rosie had never imagined she would work in heavy industry, but Pearl Harbor had changed everything. She learned to read blueprints, operate pneumatic tools, and work alongside men who initially questioned whether women could handle such demanding work. Within months, Rosie and her female colleagues were outperforming their male counterparts in both speed and precision. The cultural impact of this workforce transformation extended far beyond the factory floor. Traditional gender roles, which had seemed permanent fixtures of American society, began to shift as women took on responsibilities previously reserved for men. The image of Rosie the Riveter, popularized by Norman Rockwell's iconic Saturday Evening Post cover, became a powerful symbol of American female empowerment and patriotic duty. According to wartime production records maintained by the National Archives, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 47 million tons of artillery shells during the war years. This massive output required not only industrial conversion, but also the development of entirely new supply chains and logistics networks. Small towns across America found themselves connected to the global war effort as they produced everything from parachute silk to precision instruments. The attack on Pearl Harbor also accelerated social changes that had been slowly developing throughout the 1930s. African American workers, previously excluded from many defense industries, found new opportunities as labor shortages forced employers to abandon discriminatory hiring practices. Philip Randolph's threat of a march on Washington had already pressured Roosevelt to establish the Fair Employment Practice Committee. But Pearl Harbor gave additional urgency to efforts to fully utilize all of America's human resources. Charles "Charlie" Washington, a 25-year-old welder from Alabama, moved to California to work in the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond. The Liberty ships built there would carry American supplies to allies around the world. But for Charlie, the job represented something more personal, a chance to prove that African Americans were just as committed to defending democracy as any other Americans. The segregated South he had left behind seemed increasingly out of step with the values America claimed to be fighting for overseas. The social mixing that occurred in defense plants created unprecedented opportunities for Americans from different backgrounds to work together toward common goals. Irish Catholics from Boston worked alongside Jewish immigrants from New York, while farmers' sons from Iowa collaborated with urban sophisticates from Chicago. These interactions, multiplied millions of times across the country, helped break down regional and ethnic barriers that had divided Americans for generations. Rationing programs, implemented to ensure adequate supplies for the military, also contributed to a sense of shared sacrifice and national unity. Every American family received ration books that limited their purchases of everything from gasoline to coffee to nylon stockings. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and vacant. Lots of civilians grew their own vegetables to supplement rationed food supplies. These everyday sacrifices kept the home front connected to the global struggle and reminded Americans that everyone had a role to play in achieving victory. The speed of this transformation amazed foreign observers. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been desperately hoping for American entry into the war, marveled at how quickly the United States mobilized its resources. The country that had seemed paralyzed by isolationist sentiment in 1941 had become a unified, determined force for democracy by the end of 1942. The devastating attack on Pearl Harbor had eliminated much of America's Pacific Fleet, but it had also unleashed a military response of unprecedented scale and determination. Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed to command the Pacific Fleet just weeks after the attack, surveyed the wreckage at Pearl Harbor and immediately began planning for a campaign that would carry American forces across thousands of miles of ocean to Japan itself. The first American response came sooner than anyone expected. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in a daring raid on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, as it became known, did minimal physical damage, but delivered a powerful psychological blow to Japanese confidence while boosting American morale immeasurably. Captain William "Bill" Thompson, pilot of the bomber Ruptured Duck, described the mission as both terrifying and exhilarating. Taking off from a carrier deck in a heavily loaded Army bomber required skills that had never been taught in flight school. But Thompson and his fellow pilots were determined to strike back at the nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The sight of American bombers over Tokyo shocked the Japanese leadership, who had believed their homeland was invulnerable to attack. The strategic situation in the Pacific required American forces to develop entirely new methods of warfare. Traditional military doctrine emphasized the importance of secure supply lines and consolidated positions, but the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean made such approaches impossible. Instead, American commanders developed the strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to capture key airfields and harbors that could support further advances toward Japan. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 to June 7, 1942, became the turning point of the Pacific War. American codebreakers working in secrecy in Hawaii had intercepted Japanese communications revealing their plans to attack Midway Island. Admiral Nimitz positioned his forces to ambush the Japanese fleet, setting up what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Dive Bomber Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet at a moment when their aircraft carriers were most vulnerable. The Japanese had just recovered their first wave of attack planes and were preparing to launch a second strike when McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from the sky. Within minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted into useless metal by the force of American bombs. As documented in military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive Pacific War Chronicles, the Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible after Pearl Harbor, suddenly found itself on the defensive. American industrial production, meanwhile, was beginning to produce new ships and aircraft at a rate that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. The victory at Midway was followed by the grueling campaign for Guadalcanal, where American Marines faced their first major ground combat against Japanese forces. Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Martinez from Texas found himself fighting in conditions that no training could have prepared him for. The jungle fighting on Guadalcanal was brutal and exhausting, with both sides suffering enormous casualties in battles for airfields and strategic positions. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months and tested American resolve in ways that Pearl Harbor had not. Unlike the sudden shock of the December 7th attack, Guadalcanal was a grinding war of attrition that demanded sustained courage and determination. Marines like Martinez learned to fight in tropical heat, deal with diseases unknown in America, and face an enemy who preferred death to surrender. Each island battle that followed, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, brought American forces closer to Japan, but at an increasingly terrible cost. The Japanese military, following the code of Bushido, fought with fanatical determination, making every advance a costly proposition. American casualties mounted, but so did American resolve to finish the job that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The transformation of American military power was remarkable. The Navy that had lost 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor now deployed dozens of aircraft carriers, supported by hundreds of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. The Army, Air Forces, which had been caught on the ground in Hawaii, now mounted 1,000-plane raids against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. Most importantly, American forces had learned to work together with an efficiency and coordination that their enemies could not match. By August 1945, American forces stood poised for the final assault on Japan itself. The massive fleet assembled for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, represented the culmination of nearly 4 years of unprecedented military and industrial mobilization that had begun with the shock of Pearl Harbor. However, the development of the atomic bomb offered President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April, an alternative to what military planners estimated would cost over 1 million American casualties. The decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains controversial to this day. But in the context of 1945, it seemed to offer the possibility of ending the war without the massive bloodshed that would accompany an invasion of Japan. Captain Paul Tibbets, pilot of the Enola Gay, carried out his mission on August 6, 1945, knowing that the weapon in his bomb bay would change warfare forever. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet entry into the Pacific War, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur accepted the formal surrender of Japan. The ceremony was deliberately staged to emphasize American power and Japanese defeat, but it also marked the end of the most devastating war in human history. Among the witnesses was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had commanded the Pacific Fleet's recovery from the devastation at Pearl Harbor to complete victory over Japan. The America that emerged from World War II was fundamentally different from the nation that had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American foreign policy throughout the 1930s had been permanently shattered. Americans now understood that their security was inextricably linked to events around the world, and they were prepared to accept the responsibilities that came with being the world's dominant military and economic power. The industrial mobilization that had begun after Pearl Harbor continued to benefit American society long after the war ended. The factories that had produced tanks and aircraft were converted to manufacture automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods for a population that had endured years of rationing and sacrifice. The GI Bill provided education and housing benefits for returning veterans, fueling an economic boom that would last for decades. Women who had entered the workforce during the war faced pressure to return to traditional domestic roles, but many refused to give up their independence and career aspirations. The war had demonstrated that women could perform any job as well as men, and this knowledge would eventually contribute to the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s. The foundation for major social changes had been laid in the defense plants and military installations where traditional gender roles had been temporarily suspended. African American veterans who had fought for democracy overseas returned home determined to claim their full rights as American citizens. The contradiction between fighting fascism abroad while accepting segregation at home became increasingly difficult to maintain. The civil rights movement that would transform American society in the 1950s and 60s had its roots in the wartime experiences of African Americans who had proved their patriotism and competence under the most demanding circumstances. The attack on Pearl Harbor had intended to discourage American involvement in world affairs, but its actual effect was exactly the opposite. The isolationist America of 1941 became the global superpower of 1945, committed to maintaining international peace and security through military strength and economic leadership. The United Nations, NATO, and the Marshall Plan all reflected America's new understanding of its role in the world. Perhaps most importantly, Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the power of American unity when the nation faced a clear and immediate threat. The regional, ethnic, and class divisions that had seemed so important before the attack had proven less significant than the shared values and common purposes that bound Americans together. The memory of that unity would inspire future generations of Americans facing their own challenges and crises. The men and women who had lived through Pearl Harbor and the war that followed carried its lessons for the rest of their lives. They had seen their country transform from a divided, uncertain nation into a confident, united superpower. They had witnessed the best and worst of human nature, had experienced both devastating loss and ultimate triumph. Most importantly, they had learned that free societies, when properly motivated and organized, possessed reserves of strength that their enemies could never match or understand. The date that had lived in infamy had become the catalyst for America's finest hour.